So we will straight away move on to the continuation from the previous class. We were talking about the white double consciousness within Huck and how it was developing. But we will see that it is eventually the victory of the public fiction that the culture had, that was created as a result of the isolated culture in which the whites and the blacks were living. The public fictions did triumph, and it was Jim who lost. Jim was diminished. Throughout the novel, Twain moves Huck back and forth between the two levels of white consciousness, white double consciousness, as Huck now accepts the public pronouncements on blackness and now reaches his own conclusions concerning the nature of black folk, as I have already discussed. In the final analysis, however, Huck, for all his shrewd, sharpened insight, accepts the teachings of the society of which he is a part. Twain is simply unable to accept the humanity of Jim, or by extension the humanity of Afro-Americans. Huck and Twain are aware of the misrepresentation of the black people and the black life in the US, in the United States, but neither of them is willing to confront racist lies head on. For black people and for those sympathetic to their long struggle for fair treatment in North America, the adventures of Huckleberry Finn spirals down to a dispiriting and racist conclusion, that is. The high adventures of the middle chapters, Huck's admiration of Jim, Jim's own strong self-confidence, and the slave's willingness to protect and guide Huck are all rendered meaningless by the closing chapters, in which Twain turns Jim over to two white boys out on a lark. We will discuss about the ending of the chapter, the final escape of Jim at length towards the end of our assignment. So for now, let's just see what this analysis of the white double consciousness leads us to. Tom and Huck treat Jim as a toy as they follow Tom's complicated script for the liberation of a prisoner. From chapter 34 through and to the end of chapter 40, that is 7 chapters in all, Twain lets Tom and Huck toy with Jim. And while it is possible to readily accept Tom's perspective on Jim as a nigger, for Tom Sawyer comes off as an insensitive, self-centered, adolescent prig, it is depressing to find Huck so willing to fall in with Tom's game. Huck, after all, knows Jim, believes Jim, loves Jim, and has knowledge of Jim's love for his family. But Huck never confronts Tom, never says, "I have traveled down river with this man for miles. We have had many adventures. I have apologized to him. He has let me sleep when I should have been awake. And while he thought I was asleep, he has lamented his loss of wife and children." Huck never articulates the empathetic agony that he feels for Jim as well. He never articulates that to Tom, and that is what matters, the articulation of the acknowledgement of the black suffering. But Twain never lets Huck do so. Huck is also a part of the public fiction that the culture was creating, and in which Twain was also a part of. He was an up and famous writer. Huck never says, neither does he say, "This is my friend, and I will not allow you to toy with him and his determination to be free." Huck never mentions Jim's family in his many talks with Tom. Instead, Huck himself accepts Tom's perspective and that of Euro-American culture. Jim is returned to nigger, as Huck tells Tom, "I don't care shucks for the morality of it." I have quoted, just one moment. As I have quoted on the screen, you can see this passage when Huck tells, when Huck says to Tom, this is the part when Huck says to Tom that "I don't care shucks for the morality of it. Nohow, when I start to steal a nigger or a watermelon or a Sunday school book, I ain't no ways particular how it's done, so it's done." So you can see how his stances are changing when he's talking to Tom. Huck thereby reduces Jim to the level of watermelon and Sunday school text, regarding all three as objects to be manipulated by a shrewd white boy, and thereby casually dismisses all the good times he and Jim have had. Twain has clearly made a decision for racism, while the middle part of the book celebrates and acknowledges the growing friendship between white boy and black man. In the last part, Twain thinks it important that Jim be shoved back into his place. Twain accomplishes this end in two ways. As first, he makes over Huck's character in such a way that the youngster is made to forget the warm companionship between boy and slave. And second, he has Huck support the certainty of the good white folk of Arkansas that slavery is right, proper, and just. Put in a slightly different way, Twain opts to make Huck side with the powerful against the powerless. And it is Tom Sawyer who is the mechanism by means of which Huck finally comes to reject Jim's humanity. Now, Tom's role here also comes into consideration, which we will come back to again when we discuss the issue of the ending of the novel. Twain effectively demonstrates that most whites accept the public fiction that blacks are inferior after being persuaded by other whites. Huck has come to know a black person in a way the structural isolation of the times has prevented Tom from doing, but he readily accepts Tom's evaluation of Jim's worth. Because Tom does not belong to the same social background that Huck belongs to, right? So they are slightly different than each other, even though both of them share the same cultural mentality that was the pervasive justification of slavery at that point of time. But Huck should have done it differently than what Tom does. So Huck, as I said, Huck has come to know a black person in a way that the structural isolation of the times has prevented Tom from doing so. But Huck nonetheless readily accepts Tom's evaluation of Jim's worth. Huck clearly recognizes in the voice of Tom the voice of the white establishment and expects his friend to be anti-black. When Tom agrees to help Jim escape, Huck is shocked. And he says, "I'm bound to say Tom Sawyer fell considerable in my estimation. Only I couldn't believe it. Tom Sawyer is a nigger stealer." When Huck later learns that Tom has agreed to help Jim escape only because Tom knows Jim has already been freed, a weight is taken off his mind, as Huck has had long been worrying how Tom could help a body set a nigger free with his bringing up. The runaway boy is therefore thereby demonstrating that he understands the larger cultural forces at play. Tom's bringing up, quote unquote, that have led Tom to his attitude towards the blacks. Earlier in the novel, Huck is willing to confront these forces, as when he tells Jim he will not turn him in. He says, "People will call me a low-down abolitionist and despise me for keeping mum, but that don't make a difference." This is in chapter 8, and it is in chapter 42 that Huck recognizes Tom's attitude towards devaluating Jim. Here is a clear example of white double consciousness, for Huck indicates he understands the attitude of the whites white towards fugitive slaves and then consciously defies it. He does not, however, maintain his defiance, as he later surrenders his knowledge of Jim's humanity and allows Tom to play with his friend as though he were a toy. Huck's final repression of what might be called the Huck's final repression of this this white double consciousness that might be called the experiential aspect of his consciousness, that is the knowledge that he gains by experience, as opposed to its public component, the public fiction, the culture of which he is a part of, it comes as no real surprise. Though a black reader naturally hopes this unconventional white boy will be sufficiently independent to overcome racism. But Huck has never been fully at ease with his recognition of Jim's humanity. His knowledge of Jim clashes too sharply with public declarations on the nature of blackness. It is perhaps too much to expect that one young boy could be capable of confronting and defying the values of his time. Huck is uneasy at Jim's comments as the raft comes closer to Cairo, Illinois, and to freedom. And I'm quoting from chapter 16. He was saying how the first thing he would do when he got to be a free state, he would go to saving money and never spend a single cent. And when he got enough, would buy his wife. And then they would both work to buy the two children. And if their master wouldn't sell them, they'd get an abolitionist to go and steal them. It most froze me to hear such talk. Here was this nigger which I had as good as helped to run away, coming right out flat-footed and saying he would steal his children that belonged to a man I didn't even know, a man that hadn't even done me no harm. I was sorry to hear Jim say that. It was such a lowering of him. So he's ashamed of Jim because Jim wants to buy back his wife and children. Now, this entire sentence is wrong on so many levels. He wants to buy back his own wife and children. And Huck is appalled at this idea, and he is worried over the fact that Jim is going to try and steal back his wife and his children from some white people that Huck doesn't even know. But Huck is more than ready to sympathize, empathize with those unknown white people rather than this nigger with whom he has been on such a long journey over the symbolic river of Mississippi, which we are going to discuss it shortly. So early on in the novel, Huck has no conception of Jim as a person, much less of Jim as a man who naturally wants not only to escape from slavery himself, but to help his wife and children out of the bondage as well. Later, as Huck wrestles with the decision of whether or not to write Miss Watson, Jim's former owner, and let her know where Jim may be found, he confronts the same forces as he sets his own knowledge of Jim over against the racist teachings of the Euro-American culture to which he belongs. The boy drafts the letter to Miss Watson but tears it up, declaring it an oft-cited passage. All right then, I'll go to hell. There is no reason to doubt Huck's courage, so it comes as no surprise to see that he is prepared to confront eternal hellfire, a branch of Euro-American Christianity made clear was the certain destination of whites who helped slaves to escape from their masters. Now, this was also the education that Huck's foster family had given him. This is the Christianity that they wanted Huck to accept. But this willingness to do so has nothing to do with Jim and his needs, and everything to do with Huck and his. In a long monologue as he reflects on the mailing of a letter, which happens in chapter 31, Huck covers familiar ground as he reviews Jim's love for him, Jim's humanity, and most importantly, the ways in which Jim has served Huck. He concludes that Jim has done a great deal for him. But in none of his reflections does he consider Jim's own needs, much less those of his wife and children. Huck's failure to confront Jim's needs as an adult male makes manifest Twain's genius. Twain has made Huck a boy, not a man, and therefore, as pointed out earlier, vulnerable and dependent on the black fugitive. Out of his dependence on the runaway slave, Huck develops insight into the meaning of race that no adult white male who would have dominated Jim and not have been dominated by him could possibly have developed. By making Huck a boy, Twain has made clear the nature of slavery and race relations in the antebellum period. That is, it was known as the antebellum period. Whites know they need blacks and know that blacks are human, but also know it ill serves them to acknowledge either their need for blacks or black humanity. Huck comes close to acknowledging both the humanity of Jim and his personal dependency on him, but Twain is simply too much a man of his time to permit his youthful protagonist to expose the nature of black and white relations. Huck sides with Tom. Tom represents white supremacy, and Jim is forgotten. The novel dwindles down into a sorry, mealy-mouthed apologia for racism. They do not even tell Jim or inform Jim about the fact that he has already been freed by Miss Watson, leaving aside the inherent cruelty of withholding from a slave the knowledge that he is free and taking even a freed black ever deeper into the South. Tom's plans show little regard for reality. The idea that whites would allow an escaped fugitive to return to his home with a torchlight ceremony and a brass band is as absurd as the idea that blacks would be foolish enough to publicly celebrate his return. Neither idea showed much recognition of the realities of American life. They make about as much sense as Tom's other suggestion that the three slide out of here one of these nights and get an outfit and go for howling adventures among the Indians over in territory for a couple of weeks or two. Tom, fruits this idea that the three should, have adventures with the Indians, that is the natives. So, in this way, Huck is also diminished as Twain clearly supports racist fiction. Because by the time these concluding statements appear in the novel, it is clear that Twain has made his choice, and little additional evidence is necessary that Tom Sawyer has racist conceptions of black life. In the closing passages of the novel, Twain once again brings the elements of white double consciousness together as Jim is provided one last chance to demonstrate his humanity. After some prodding by Huck, Jim admits that he has kept from the boy the fact that his father is dead. When he saw the naked body of the dead man in a disreputable house floating down the river, Jim's first impulse was to protect Huck from the sight. And when on examining the body he discovered it to be Pap, his second impulse was to protect Huck from this knowledge as well. This final indication of the essential kindness of Jim has little impact on Huck, who in the closing paragraph is careful to tell the reader all about Tom and himself, including Aunt Sally's plans to adopt him. But the reader who is interested in learning that what Jim intends to do, how he intends to rejoin his family, and what plans he has for freeing them is left in the dark when Huck flatly concludes there ain't nothing more to write about. Huck is not interested in the fate of Jim, much less that of his family. Nor is Tom, nor was Twain. In his widely read study of race relations in the United States, Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal, Gunnarmyrdal, argued that the white Americans felt guilty about their treatment of blacks, and that this guilt would eventually lead to the improvement of race relations. Myrdal was severely criticized by black scholars who insisted whites felt no particular guilt for the things they had done and were doing to Afro-Americans. In the wake of widespread urban riots in the 1960s, the National Agency Commission on Civil Disorders seemingly sided with these blacks, observing in its report that what white Americans have never fully understood, but what the Negro can never forget, is that white society is deeply implemented in the ghetto. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. A ghetto is a place where the blacks were pushed down to, where the slaves were pushed down to in order to form a completely black community. There was no interaction with the white races in these ghettos. There was no work in these ghettos. There was no entertainment in these ghettos. So prostitution came as work and entertainment. Violence came as work and entertainment. And it was stereotyped that these ghettos give rise to sexual diseases, other diseases, violence and crime. So this is the bigger propaganda, bigger picture, or the bigger narrative that was behind the formation of the ghettos. So that is why Myrdal is saying that white institutions created it, they maintain it, and the white society condones it. White double consciousness suggests that most whites are indeed aware, some like Huck by virtue of personal experience, of black suffering. Moreover, almost all whites are aware, also by virtue of personal experience, of the humanity of black folk. But set over and against this knowledge is not only the power of the state, what some students of race relations are coming to call institutionalized racism. It is the state that allows ghettoization of the black community, the state that condones, authenticates, legitimizes the formation of ghettos, yet does not try to critique out the resultant activities of these ghettos, where the occupants are none other than, each and every occupant, they are none other than those against whom generations of atrocities have been committed. Ill-educated, not educated even, living in their most natural of the forms, without any technological innovations which were withheld from them, which have been withheld for them. So how are they to be progressive? How are they to progress? How are they to become advanced? How are they to come out of their narrow visions of freedom? Freedom for which for them is physical freedom, and not freedom in the modern sense as we mean it. This is institutionalized racism, but a public fiction which insists that blacks are less human than whites. To the extent they are able to repress their personal knowledge of humanity of blacks and accept this public fiction, whites are able to escape the guilt suggested by Myrtle. Mark Twain clearly reveals knowledge of the two different levels of white thought concerning blacks, and Adventures of Huckleberry Finn also reveals Twain's knowledge of Euro-American double consciousness in other areas of life, as he repeatedly allows his favored characters to show a healthy disdain for some of the most celebrated public fictions of the era. Now, this white double consciousness, it leaves Huck in complete isolation, as he cannot fully belong to any one community. Yes, it's true that he does choose the racist counterpart of his mind in the end, as he, as the great escape of Jim is nothing but a huge farce, as we are going to discuss in the future, in future classes. But at the same point of time, he has also acquired a certain sense of the black humanity through experience, through his adventures with Jim, as we have seen in certain examples in the previous and in this lecture as well. So this white double consciousness, it leaves him in complete isolation, and as a result he suffers intensely from his loneliness, which is also a source of his inner freedom. The fact that he cannot belong to any community, that he cannot belong to his own family or to the foster family, which tries to legitimize him, which tries to Catholicize him, which tries to educate him in a custom, in a convention, and in a culture to which he really does not belong, and which he really does not try to understand even. So as he develops this white double consciousness, his isolation becomes more profound, as he cannot really continue the friendship, the strong bond that he forms with Jim, as a consequence of the culture to the public fiction in which he has been born and bred up. And therefore he finds this isolation as the true source of his freedom when he continues over the raft after Jim has gone away. This image of isolation as a source of inner freedom was a very common trope in American literature, as we can see in the poems of Robert Frost, Walt Whitman. Frost's most famous poem, Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood. It is about the American individual trying to make a choice, trying to confront that freedom of choice that he has. We have Fitzgerald's Gatsby. He's rich, individualistic, successful, yet he will not miss a night to stand by the river and gaze at the love that he will never get. Because it is not the financial differences that separate them, but the class differences. Whitman's Leaves of Grass are profound with poems that talk about a loafer who tries to attain individualism, tries to attain the freedom. And we, of course, we have the American poet Eliot, later turned, European. We have Prufrock, the modern Hamlet, the true loner, the first loner, the first and the most important loner in literature that we have. So it is the raft then that becomes a symbol, that becomes the vehicle for freedom over the racially neutral Mississippi that spars across this land, which is strewn with, obsessed with maintaining a public fiction of isolation, public fiction of black inferiority, and also a land which in its heart knew that there is no difference between the humanity of a black and a white folk. So this raft then essentially becomes a symbol of freedom, as I would like to show a quote directly from the text. So let's see how the Mississippi, or how the raft becomes a symbol of freedom, and how Mississippi becomes or acquires an image or figures in the novel as a racially neutral zone over which this white adolescent boy and this fugitive slave can negotiate their relations, their friendship, their differences, and have, if nothing else, an adventure. So this highlighted portion I'm going to read out. This is from chapter 19. Huck is the narrator, of course. He's saying, 2 or 3 days and nights went by. I reckon I might say they swam by. They slid along so quiet and smooth and lovely. Here is the way we put in time. It was a monstrous big river down there, sometimes 1.5 miles wide. We ran nights and laid up and hid daytimes. Soon as night was most gone, we stopped navigating and tied up. Nearly always in the dead water under a towhead, and then cut young cottonwoods and willows and hid the raft with them. Then we set out the lines. Next we slid into the river and had a swim, so as to freshen up and cool off. Then we sat down on the sandy bottom where the water was about knee deep and watched the daylight come. Not a sound anywhere. So look at how the Mississippi forms a primary symbol of peace, primary symbol of brotherhood, of fraternity, where it is the place where Huck and Jim bond the most, not over land, but over water. Not over still grounds beneath their feet, ground which authenticates slavery, but over the moving water surface, which has no single home, it's always shifting, it is always transcending boundaries. It knows no shape. The water knows no shape. The water sees no color, sees no differences. This is the place where both of them unite. No sound anywheres, perfectly still, just like the whole world was asleep. Only sometimes the bullfrogs are cluttering, maybe. The first thing to see, looking away over the water, was a kind of dull line. It was the woods on the other side. You couldn't make nothing else out than a pale place of the sky, in the sky. Then more paleness spreading around. Then the river softened up a way off and wasn't black anymore, but grey. So it mingles, that even the colors do not maintain binaries, as it keeps reflecting as the water keeps reflecting the light of all of the world. You could see little dark spots drifting along ever so far away, trading scows and such things, and long black streaks, rafts. Sometimes you would hear a sweep creaking or jumbled up voices. It was so still, and sounds come so far, and by you could see a streak on the water, which you know by the look of the streak that there is a snag there in the swift current which breaks on it and makes that streak look that way. And you see the swift current which and you see the mist curl up off the water, off of the water, and the east reddens up, and the river, and you make out a long cabin in the edge of the woods, away on the bank on the other side, being a woodyard, likely, and piled by them cheats so you can throw a dog around it, through it anyways. These are all navigating terms. Then a nice breeze springs up and comes fanning you from over there, so cool and fresh to smell on account of the woods and the flowers, but sometimes not that way, because they've left dead fish laying around, gars and such, and they do get pretty rank. And next you've got the full day and everything smiling in the sun and the songbirds just going it. So this is a beautiful description of the river from Huck's own perspective. And then this paragraph, sometimes we'd have the whole river to ourselves for the longest time. Now this is the place that both of them can feel that it is their own. Yonder was the banks and the islands across the water, and maybe a spark which was a candle in a cabin window, and sometimes on the water you could see a spark or two on a raft or a scow, and maybe you could hear a fiddle or a song coming over from one of them crafts. It's lovely to live on a raft. We have the sky up there. Now he's describing the raft and the Mississippi, is giving his own perspective, but he's using the plural pronoun of we. We had the sky up there, all speckled with stars, and we used to lay on our backs and look up at them and discuss about whether they was made or only just happened. Jim, he allowed they was made, but I allowed they happened. I judged it would have took too long to make so many. Jim said the moon could laid them. Well, this is just a funny understanding of the stars. Well, that looked kind of reasonable, so I didn't say nothing against it, because I've seen a frog lay most as many, so of course it could be done. We used to watch the stars that fell too, and see them streak down. Jim allowed they'd got spoiled and was hove out of the nest. So the river is broad and still, and it is safe to be on it. Through the river, those several boys we find in the novel, they find a secret place to play in forming a gang. It shows that the river can serve as a shelter to protect people and provide a space for people to form their relatively isolated community, in which Huck and Jim are staying together for a long while during the journey and forming a mutual understanding and reliance. In this sense, the traits of the river, being grand and isolated from the land, provide the basic necessity for Huck and Jim's development of relationship, which evolves over 4 stages. I will brush over them. I will be sharing an essay with you which deals exclusively with the symbolism of the Mississippi. So I will just discuss a few excerpts from it. The first stage deals with the purpose, the different purposes for both these characters' escape. Jim's escape is very different. Jim's reason for escape is very different from that of Huck. Huck intends to escape from being abused and civilized. Jim hopes to become a free man. We will discuss this escape, as I said, later on. The first stage of Huck and Jim's relationship is founded on the common basic needs of human beings: to gain protection and to have the company of a fellow human being. Huck is extremely glad to see Jim after having escaped from his father's abuse. He says, "I was never ever so glad to see Jim. I wasn't lonesome now." Can be easily made clear by his experiences and mentality before they met. On the one hand, the river provides Huck freedom, making him feel like he could go and stop anywhere he wants to, like the river, and the rise of the river made it easy for Huck to get where he wants to. However, on the other hand, the river is big and terrifyingly dark during the night. So Huck gets very tired of being scared and alerted and being alone. Thus, when Huck arrives at Jackson's Island, he runs the canoe into a deep tent and parts the willow branches to get in. He gets his gun and slips out of the edges of the woods, runs across the campfire, stopping every minute or two to listen. Huck is extremely anxious and clearly lacks the security, lacks the security of fellowship of another human being. Then we can easily imagine how happy and relieved Huck was when he met Jim. It is a good start to their friendship and the precondition for the creation of racial equality between Twain's two protagonists. The second is the development of this relationship, of this friendship, as it gets modified and changed and added on to, substituted throughout the course of their journey over the Mississippi. The third is when Huck comes to terms with his white double consciousness and tentatively realizes his sense of guilt in relation to his social class and religious belief. And the fourth stage is a reversal of the perspective that we just studied while we were studying the aspect of double consciousness. As he overcomes his religious and moral queries and qualms, Huck gets the victory over prevailing morality. He does decide to go to hell at the end of the novel, as we just discussed, but in a quite reversing interpretation, his decision to go to hell, his decision to continue to help Jim escape, even at the face of eternal damnation, it makes him braver. He determines to go to hell in order to save Jim. This is the climax in their friendship because it is based on profound self-knowledge. This enables Huck to recognize that Jim is his equal, both in terms of emotions as well as intelligence and talents. The river then stands in sharp contrast with the land. It has a natural power to isolate people from their society. Thus, on the river, it is possible for people from different social statuses to form a new relationship. The relationship formed on the river will be an equal one because of the traits of the river. It sees no differences. It will take away in its flow anything and everything that comes in its way. Under its changeable weather and determined route, cooperation is the only way for survival. Huck and Jim's relationship is developing during their journey along the Mississippi River. The development of their relationship is not a simple one, which is only a development of their friendship. The foundation of this development is mutual understanding. The journey and the river provide the possibility for them to get such a mutual understanding, which cannot be achieved on the land where there lies racially repressed society. In this sense, the river provides the material necessity for them to get racial equality. Now, throughout the course of the classes of the future classes that we are going to have, we are going to discuss the role of Mississippi throughout the various lectures. But this was in continuation this was necessary. This short discussion upon the Mississippi was necessary in order to maintain a flow from the necessity of this symbol, that proves the necessity of this symbol of Mississippi as that which provides them freedom. It is necessary to establish the failure of the novel to criticize race, and it establishes the racial inclination that Twain and Huck eventually choose as a result of their white double consciousness. So in the next class we will be discussing more upon the issue of race, and they are all interrelated. It's not that they are all isolated from each other, they are all interrelated, but I will be focusing on the issue of race more specifically in the next class.